Thank you very much, Christina. It's wonderful to be here in Bergen. I've been here a few days, actually. I came here early because I've never been here before. And I was lucky enough yesterday to be on the Norway in a Nutshell tour, and I experienced this week's 2 hours of sunshine, which was fantastic. So I'm sorry, I did have that. So you'll have to wait until next week for the next batch. I gather it rains here 225 days a year, so no surprise, this is the home of black metal. Anyway, over the next hour, my intention is to transform your relationship with sound, something that surrounds us all the time, and yet something that we don't generally think about very much at all. So the title of this talk is The Power of Sound, and I'm going to try and cram a great deal into the next 60 minutes. Well, I'll try and end a few minutes short so that if anybody's got any questions, then I'll do my best to answer them. I'm going to be looking at how sound affects us. I'm going to be looking at sound and brands and how you're all from media brands, I think. I doubt if there are many brand owners here at this conference, but if you think about that conversation in terms of your brands, your media brands, a lot of what I say there could be very useful to you, I think. Then I'm going to have a look at radio just for a few moments in particular, because, of course, of all the media that are relevant to a conversation about sound, radio is the most. And then finally, I'm going to give you a little discourse on listening and why that's important. Of course, you know, we're all running media. If nobody's listening, there's not much point, is there? And there is a threat to listening in the world, so I'll cover the threat, and I'll give you some tools which hopefully will help you to become great conscious listeners, something to take away with you. Let me just start by explaining what the Sound Agency does. We've been going for about 10 years, and we work around the world with some of the leading brands in the world, answering the question, how does your brand sound? It's a question that many brands, surprisingly, have just never thought about. Along the way, I wrote a book. The book is called Sound Business, and I've also been covered a great deal in the media, and this tells me you guys particularly find sound fascinating, especially, of course, radio, but also television. In this country, I've been on Skavlan, which I think is a well-known show here, talking about sound. People love it. Just this morning, talking to an Australian radio station, ABC, because there is a story about birdsong and how it affects us, circulating the world. So this is something, I think, which when you open it up, I hope you'll find interesting, and I think everybody finds interesting, the subject of sound. I've also been honored to give now 4 talks on the TED stage. Has anybody here not come across TED? Anybody? A couple of you? Well, then I give you a gift. For those of you who haven't, go and check out TED.com straight away. Well, not right now, but you know, the next time you get to a computer. It's full of amazing talks by brilliant people. I'm not bigging myself up here, but lots of other brilliant people. Everything from black holes to jazz music to whatever you care to be interested in. Now, let me move on and talk about the way in which sound affects us. We stand on street corners shouting over noise like this, pretending that it doesn't exist. You know, if you could see this, or if you could smell this, you would never put up with it. But because it's sound, we've developed, all of us, an unconscious reaction which is just to suppress it. In fact, our relationship with sound looks something like this. Most of the time, that's what we do, we just suppress it. And yet sound affects every one of you and me in 4 significant ways. And I'm just going to go through those 4 ways with you right now. Sorry about that. It's a little shot of cortisol, which is your fight-flight hormone. Now, I hope your alarm clock at home doesn't sound anything like that, because cortisol is not good for you. First thing in the morning is not good for you at all during the day. These constant shots of cortisol are not good. And yet we get them in urban environments all the time. A bus's air brakes go off next to us, or somebody drops something, or there's a jackhammer goes off, and suddenly you get this shot of cortisol. Let me calm you down again. If I leave this sound on for a little while, you'd all start dozing off eventually. Surf, a very relaxing sound, roughly 12 cycles per minute, very similar to the breathing of a sleeping human being. You can almost hear somebody snoring there. Also, of course, a sound you associate with being on a beach, no cares, on holiday, a very relaxing sound. So sound entrains our rhythms all the time. Heart rate, breathing, hormone secretions, even brain waves get changed by the sound around you all the time. Second way sound affects us, psychological. this piece of music isn't going to make you feel happy. It wasn't designed to make you feel happy. We all know how music is a very, very good carrier of emotion. We can use it to enhance a mood or to counteract a mood if we want to. But it's not the only sound that carries emotional weight. We use birdsong a great deal. I just mentioned it earlier on. We use this a great deal in the sound agency, in offices and various other situations, because we've all learned over hundreds of thousands of years that when the birds are singing, we're safe. Things are okay. If something bad is about to happen, they suddenly stop, and then there's a little frisson, isn't there? There's a little feeling, what happened? Normally, if a tsunami or an earthquake is coming, the birds stop. It's not a comforting sound. So we deploy birdsong in many places to create that physically relaxed emotional state. And also, of course, birdsong is nature's alarm clock, so it makes us mentally alert too. Third way sound affects us is cognitive. You can't understand two people talking at the same time, or in this case, one person talking twice. Even a woman cannot understand two people talking at the same time. I'm sorry, ladies, but it is true. We have bandwidth for roughly 1.6 human conversations. So if you work in an office that sounds like this, especially if you can hear one conversation on the other side of the desk, that is taking up your 1 of 1.6, and you're left with just 0.6 in your head to listen to the voice that's trying to write that report or assemble those symbols or do that mathematics. The research varies in terms of the effect on productivity. The biggest number I've found is this one. Now, at this point, there's normally nudges and knowing looks exchanged between members of the audience who work in situations like that and know perfectly well that their productivity is being devastated by the noise around them. Can't think, can't work, and so people go home or camp in boardrooms. I'm not saying open plan space is a bad thing. I'm saying we do also need quiet working space. So we need to be sensitive to noise and to the sound environment that's productive for each of us when designing our office spaces. Fourth way sound affects us is behaviorally. Of course it does, with all that other stuff going on. So ask yourself, is this person ever going to drive at a steady 35 kilometers per hour? Perhaps not. We're all familiar with that effect. The pumping music comes on and the right foot goes down. We get adrenalized. At the very simplest level, we will move away from unpleasant sound if we can. So if I were to put this sound on and leave it for the next 50 minutes or so, I don't think many of you would be sitting here by the end. For people who can't get away from noise like that, the effects are devastating. The EU numbers are really frightening about this. Something like 1 in 4 of Europe's population is having its sleep disturbed by sound above the World Health Organization maximum recommended levels at night. That's 1 in 4 Europeans. That's like 100 million people in Greater Europe who are suffering effects of sleep deprivation at some level. It's a very, very serious problem. And for retailers, of course, which is a lot of the work we do at the sound agency, this is a major effect. Because if people are moving away from unpleasant sound, and if retail sound is unpleasant, and I will show you a few examples of that later on, well, this is what they lose. That's a pretty frightening number for retailers. At the sound agency, we've developed a model of sound. This is a scientific application. So you can see at the bottom there are the outcomes that I just described: physiological, psychological, cognitive, behavioral. In the middle, we have some filters. What's the space about? What are people trying to do in the space? Who are the people? What's the brand or values behind it? And what's the environment, the acoustics, or any intrusive noise? And then at the top, we have the basic building blocks of sound. Its tempo, its pitch, its texture, density, which means how much attention is the sound calling. Now, we've run it this way. We look at the sound in a space, consider the nature of the space, and then we say this is the effect the sound is having. That's called an audit. We do that all the time, all over Europe, in shopping malls. At the moment, that's our biggest area of expertise. If you run it the other way, rather more excitingly, it means we can actually design sound. You can do this in your homes, in your offices, design sound so that it's more appropriate for the activity that we're undertaking in any space. So that's a reasonably methodical way of doing it. Now, I get to this point with many brand directors. Let's talk about brands for a couple of minutes. And the brand directors say, well, that's very interesting, So we'll do sound maybe next year. We've got some other priorities at the moment. We're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing the other. So we'll take a look at sound in the future. To which I say, well, there's a problem with that. The problem with that is you're already doing sound. Every brand is making sound all the time. You know, we don't make light as human beings, but we do make sound. You do, I do, I'm doing it right now. And brands do the same thing. They emanate sound all the time, whether it's delivery trucks, whether it's people on the phone, all sorts of aspects. In every way, a brand is making noise. And if that noise is not planned or designed, then it would be a miracle, wouldn't it, if it were working for the brands. And that includes every one of your brands that you work for. Whether it's a TV station, a radio station, they make a lot of noise, or even a newspaper. So all of them are making noise all the time. And the media landscape, the whole brand landscape, has changed, hasn't it? On the left-hand side, we have the old world. I would suggest that that's gone. We're no longer there. We've moved. It's, I used to give this talk and say, we're moving. I think we've moved to the right-hand side. And some of the important words on that right-hand side, words like multisensory and emotional. Emotional, for example, is something which is really becoming now understood, that we don't buy with our heads, we buy with our hearts. We engage with brands very much at a gut feel emotional level. So I like this quote from the American brand guru Robert Pasikoff. And if you think about the last time, for example, you bought something expensive, let's say an expensive pair of shoes or a motorbike or a car or something like that, I would suggest at the moment you bought that thing, you were down here, it was, I want it. And then you come out going, well, that was a good thing to buy because. So really, purchasing takes place pretty much down there, doesn't it? In the emotional, non-conscious part of us. And then we post-rationalize. That's borne out by this study of a lot of advertising campaigns, which shows that emotional advertising campaigns are twice as effective as rational advertising campaigns in terms of big profit gains for that brand in the following year. So that's that was a huge number of 1,400 advertising campaigns. Now, I say all this because I think the senses are the gateways to the emotions. If you want to engage people emotionally, it's not enough just to engage their eyes. I suggest that the senses have got different elements of conscious and non-conscious in them. Now, this is a guess. This is not based on research. This is the feeling I have for myself. See if it reflects how you feel in terms of sight being very conscious. I mean, I know where I'm looking, yes? I have eyelids. I can close my eyes. Hearing, on the other hand, I have no earlids, and nor do any of you, I think. Your hearing works even while you sleep. You don't have to be awake to be hearing. You know that if there's a strange noise in your house at night, you will wake up. So your hearing is working all the time, and it's a passive sense. Sound comes right inside your head, vibrates your eardrums inside your head. It touches you. There's a big emotional impact from that kind of non-conscious effect. Same with smell, less so with touch and taste, because I know pretty much what I'm doing with those most of the time. So if that's true, then it's important that we engage across all the senses. And the senses affect one another. The latest research in an area called cross-modal effects is very interesting. I don't know if any of you have come across this. It's a word that means the way in which the senses affect one another. We can't just take them in isolation because they intertwine. Let me give you an example of this. This is called the McGurk illusion. What I would like you to do is to look at the screen and listen to what this guy's saying.
Ba, 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba.
Now, most people looking at the screen will be hearing da, da. Now I would like you to close your eyes, please.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, 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 ba.
Now, on the video, he's saying gaga. So your eyes see gaga, your ears hear baba, which you can now hear is what he's actually saying, and your brain says that's da-da. You can't override this. If you open your eyes again and look at the screen, you will hear da-da.
ba, 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 ba.
Now that's interesting, isn't it? I've just shown you that what you hear is not necessarily real. You are making it up. In fact, of course, you make up all of reality. It's just a map. But in this case, your sight is affecting your hearing. And the senses intertwine all the time. A couple more examples of this. Professor Charles Spencer at Oxford University put some headphones on people eating crisps, and he mic'd up the sound of crisp eating. And he boosted the frequency 5 kilohertz with the effect that crisps were reported to be 15% crunchier in the mouth. So the mouthfeel was affected by the sound of eating the crisps. And a final example, I'm sure lots of you use this product, probably not. When CFCs were banned a few years ago, the packaging for this product went from going tst to going ft. And the customers reported it wasn't working properly anymore. It didn't have any effect anymore. It was weak. So they spent a great deal of money re-engineering the packaging without CFCs to go tst again, and it's working fine once more. So the sound of the packaging affects how people actually perceive the product is working on them. Cross-modal effects. If you get these cross-modal effects lined up, you get a thing called super-additivity. And in the world of super-additivity, 1 + 1 is not 2. 1 + 1 can be as much as 12. Here's some research from the neurological field where they found that a congruent sound added to a visual stimulus increased the impact of the visual stimulus by 1,107%, which is roughly 12 times. And if you run it the other way and you make an incongruent sound pointing in the wrong direction to your visual stimulus, then you can be down to just 14% of the starting impact. Now, for a brand that spends, say, $100 million a year on marketing, ignoring senses is very dangerous. I mean, think about it. Would you like to hang out in your local supermarket, for example? Now, does it look awful? No, probably not. They spend a lot of money on flows and signage and so forth. Does it smell awful? Well, no, they pump freshly baking bread smells back into the supermarket now to keep us all comfortable. It sounds dreadful. And therefore, most people carry out a commando raid on the supermarket with a list in and out as fast as possible. And they lose a lot of money for that reason. The sound is undermining all of that money they spend on visuals and olfactory marketing. Unfortunately, it's true to say that in the world of media, in the world of marketing, the eyes have it. Now, I could talk for a very long time about why this is the case, about the fact that we're an incredibly ocular culture, but I'm not going to go into that in depth. I'll just reflect that the number is roughly 83% of marketing money is spent purely on the eyes. And that's not sensible, because this comes from Martin Lindstrom's book, Brand Sense, which was an interesting book, but based on a very, very big piece of quite well-defined market research by Millward Brown. There's the 83% in the big green column here, and this is the amount spent on the other senses. The blue bars are what you get if you ask people which sense is the most important one to them in the way they relate to the world. Now, there's a mismatch there, isn't there? And that makes a big opportunity right there. Now, yes, you could say there's an even bigger one in the smell column, but sight and sound have got two very important things in common. First, you can broadcast them. And I'm not aware of anybody having successfully broadcast smell. Some people try very hard, but it's not happened yet. Second, you can say specific things in sight and in sound. And again, not so much with smell. You can create a lovely ambience with smell, and smell can really, it can take you back to your grandmother's house in a fraction of a second. But it's pretty hard to say anything really specific to a large group of people with smell. So I would suggest that is a huge opportunity, and one that's really not explored yet by most brands. Although we're now seeing this happen. There's an association of branding agencies. We have awards each year. We have a congress where 120 of us came together in Oxford last year, and most major brands are now considering this, I'm happy to say. So that you understand the way this works for your brands, and maybe you can see some opportunities, maybe for your clients, if there are any salespeople here, maybe for the companies you're talking to, but certainly for your own brands. Let me just whiz around the 8 ways in which brands are making sound and can make better sound. I think it's an interesting conversation anyway. First is product sound. Now, more important for some brands than others. Pair of trousers, not terribly important. This brand, very important indeed. In fact, they tried to trademark this sound, Harley-Davidson, a few years ago. They didn't succeed because there is a Yamaha engine that sounds very similar, but it was a close call. Kellogg's have a trademarked crunch. And anybody who uses a proper computer knows this sound. Now, it's probably most of you because it's very, very prevalent in media. You know when somebody in an airport fires up a Mac, yes? Sounds like that. Microsoft, however, changed the startup sound of Windows with every successive release of the operating system. Why do they do that? It's lost any brand it ever had for the ears. It's not just about the sound of using the product, it's also the name of the product. We've done workshops, for example, with shampoos. Not much sound of a shampoo itself, but the name can be really, really crucial as a sound associated with the brand. And then there is the packaging, which I've showed you can have a significant effect. And finally, we've got the sound of what goes on around the usage of the brand. So think of something like Bacardi, for example, then you probably think of Latin music and people having a good time, party sound, and so forth. They can own that space, and they pretty much do. So the sound of the product itself can be very significant. Also true for media brands. Think of Yahoo, for example, with that lovely yodel that they use in America. So the name of the product can become a really significant sound. Then we've got brand voice. Now, I don't mean this figuratively in the way advertising agencies talk about tone of voice. I mean this absolutely literally, voice I'm talking about. I wonder if any of your brands have defined this. How does your brand voice naturally sound? Is it old or young? Is it lively or laid back? Is it cheeky or is it very formal and polite? Is it masculine or feminine? Does it have an accent? If we define a default, then we can get some consistency in conversations. I'm not talking about everybody being a robot, but I'll give you an example. The first time I ever got on Virgin Atlantic plane many years ago, the stewardess said, "Hello, sexy," which I remember very well because it's the only time anybody's ever said that to me. And also because it was so surprising. I mean, if she'd been working for British Airways, she would have been sacked for saying that. But for Virgin, it was perfect. Virgin is a cheeky, young, challenging, irreverent brand. It's supposed to be fun and informal and surprising in that way. I don't think she was told to say that. I do think she understood the Virgin brand voice in her heart. That's consistency. And these little interactions, you know, can make a huge difference in the way that people perceive what we do and who we come from. Telephone sound is the natural extension of brand voice, and most of the time it's a disaster. How does it go? Press 1 for this, press 2 for that, press 3 if you're getting pretty frustrated because none of these are the thing you want, press 4, oh, you've gone. I mean, how many of us have slammed the phone down in frustration at a system like that? I bet almost everybody here. Yes, lots of hands going up. You know what I mean. I think this is losing more business worldwide than any other single aspect of business. Badly designed telephone systems, mainly made by technical people, bless them, but they're not marketing people, and they don't test the experience. Now, we have an aging demographic, yes, and it's been shown that older people hate these things particularly. We really need to do better on the telephone. All of us. Let's have a little detour into music because, I mean, this will be very dear to many of your hearts. I know there are a lot of media brands here which are very involved with music. So let's talk about music for a moment. Anybody who's flown on this airline will know this piece of music. This is the Flower Duet from an opera called Lakmé by Delibes. And British Airways have been using this piece of music everywhere, like on the plane, on the phone, on the website, absolutely everywhere for years and years and years. A few years ago, they sacked their advertising agency, which was then M&C Saatchi, and they employed a new agency who shall remain nameless. And the new agency came in and thought, we'll get rid of that old classical stuff. Who needs that anymore? So they replaced it with this.
We believe your holiday should start before you arrive. You're our guest.
So it sounds like
should
a pretty good
expect to
idea.
check
That
in
song's called
online.
Leaving on a Jet Plane.
Choose where to sit.
Till you realise the second line of
Fly
that
to
song goes,
destinations.
don't know when I'll be back again. Might not be the best message to give business travellers or their families, perhaps. That song was written by a guy called John Denver, who died in a plane crash, unfortunately. Not the best choice in the world. And actually, independently even of those things, when British Airways did this, there were thousands of complaints. People were writing in and emailing and phoning and saying, where is our lovely classical music? They didn't know what it was. What they did know is that it was British Airways. BA was chucking out a sonic asset. Didn't even know it had it, and it was really valuable. I wonder if any of your brands have got a hidden sonic asset that you might want to protect, cherish, nourish, and make more of. While I'm on the subject of music, let me just mention it a little bit more in detail, because music is a really important sound. I mean, alongside the human voice, it's probably the most significant sound on the planet. Every human society on the planet has music, every single one. There's not been a tribe in the Amazon anywhere that's ever been discovered that hasn't got music. So it springs up everywhere, independently. To be musical is to be human. To be human is to be musical. We recognize music very fast, and we associate it very strongly and very quickly. So it's got lots of power. I'll give you a couple of examples. I think most of you are old enough to recognize this. I did do this a little while back to an audience of 500 students in Istanbul, and there was a wall of blank faces. So maybe I have to get more current. For anybody under about 30, that's Hard Day's Night by the Beatles, but most of the rest of you will have got that. I'm sure every single one of you will associate this sound with something. That's 1 second of music. It's powerful, isn't it? But you know what they say in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. What music is not is a veneer. It's not something to smear across every place in the world mindlessly. Actually, music's intention generally is to be listened to, and in sound, intention is very, very important. So if you're in a mobile phone shop talking about 92 handsets and 147 tariffs with an 18-year-old who knows no more about it than you do you want pop music playing at the same time? Because the pop music is going, listen to me, listen to me, listen to me. I haven't been in many recording studios around the world where people are hunched over a mixing desk late at night going, let's make something nobody wants to listen to. Music's intention is to be listened to. It takes cognition. It's generally quite dense. Not all music. I mean, if you want to work and you want to use ambient music, for example, that can work, or trance music, very repetitive. Your brain knows what it's doing after a few seconds and switches off. But try working to classical music, bebop, jazz, pop music with vocals. Not very effective. Your kids may tell you they work better with music. Not true. They may enjoy it more, and they may even be able to go on longer. So it may be more productive that way. But while the music is on, they are doing less work in the head. It's just not possible because the music is taking cognition away. So we need to be very careful about the way we employ music in public spaces and in media. Let's talk about a fragment of music many brands use, a sonic logo. You'll probably be familiar with this one. And let me just talk about one from a little bit nearer home, actually. This is a client of ours. We didn't do this for them, but it's a good story anyway, and hopefully a client on the rebound now from some pretty tough times. You may not recognize this piece of music, but you will in a moment. About that's a piece called Grand Vals, which Nokia used in a TV commercial in 1992. And it was so popular that they made it one of their candidate ringtone choices for the handsets. Of the candidates, it was the only one that was out of copyright. So they chose it, cost them nothing. It became, of course, this, which is the world's most played tune. I've calculated this with Nokia, something like 1.8 billion times a day. That song issues forth from a Nokia device. That's 20,000 times a second. It's an amazingly prevalent sound, and it's one which has had a huge effect on their brand recall. They do know they need to keep it organic and developing. So they've just, for example, for India and for China, they've just crowdsourced it. They had a competition in both of those two places for a local version of Nokia Tune, which was composed, and the winning composer won $10,000, and the winning composition is on the handsets in those countries. So you can release your sonic assets to crowdsourcing. Now, that's an interesting idea. I wonder if any of you are using crowdsourcing at all in your sound. I'll just gloss over advertising sound, really. I don't know if you have Tony in Scandinavia. He does exist in many countries in the world, and it's one of the oldest and most familiar sounds to certainly Americans and Brits. He's been doing that for about 60 years. There have been 5 Tonys. They die off, and they have to get replaced with another one. Advertising sound generally is pretty good. They know what they're doing. They've learned a great deal from the ace exponents of sound, the film industry. Probably, actually, now the film industry is number 2 in the world, actually, in terms of using sound. Anybody think of what number 1 industry would be in terms of using sound? Thank you. Exactly. If you unroll a game, it's many, many, many times longer than a feature film, and it's interactive. And they're using really clever stuff in game sound design now. So advertising, learned a lot from those people. Generally quite good, can be a little bit campaign specific, and forget the brand needs to have consistency. But otherwise, let's move on to a couple of more interesting places. First of all, soundscapes. It's what we do most of the time. I mentioned retail sound earlier. Let me just suggest that most retail sound, now you can think about your own experiences as I say this, most retail sound has 3 things in common. First, it's accidental. Nobody designed it. It's just the sound of what's going on in the space, the exhaust gas of the economy, if you like. Second, it's incongruent. It doesn't match the visual branding because they haven't designed it. And third, it's downright hostile, and it leaves us feeling like this, even if we don't look like this. Give you a couple of examples here. This is a very posh supermarket in the UK called Waitrose. Shelf stackers dropping trays behind you, so you get this noise that makes you jump as somebody drops it on the floor. I don't even have to introduce this one to you. We've all met these poor creatures, and they just go on screaming like this until they die in a corner somewhere. Nobody takes them out of service and oils them, and it destroys soundscapes. Another favorite, chiller cabinets. This is Marks and Spencer with mist drifting down across the vegetables. Stand between 2 of these, 80 decibels. It feels like being in a factory, not a retail environment. And then the most common one of all, horribly chosen music delivered through a cheap sound system. I mean, this really did sound like this. We haven't tweaked this at all. Who thinks this is a pleasant place to shop in, for goodness sake? That's just nasty. And finally, we have doors open, the current obsession of architects with hard surfaces, steel, stone, glass, wood, everything hard and reflective, terrible acoustics, it's all rattling around in the space and leaving us feeling like this after about 10 minutes of shopping. And we leave, is what we do. Now, even a brand like Starbucks, which I haven't seen a Starbucks in Bergen. Is there a Starbucks in Bergen? No. Sorry, I'm impartial here. I did see a McDonald's, so it's not all good. But even a brand like this. Now, Starbucks would say they know their musical territory pretty well. Yes, they have this kind of cool, funky jazz, world music, blues thing going on. But you put music on top of this, and it's just more noise. Sadly, music on noise is noise. And Starbucks haven't twigged that one yet. They need to work out the acoustics of the space before they start to put the music into it so that we have a pleasant experience. This can actually, if you do it right, it can have a huge effect. And this is a test to show the dangers, really, of doing it wrong. This is a test done by some academics in the UK a little while ago. They had a supermarket with 2 gondola ends, French wine, German wine. Absolutely no difference between the two in terms of the way they looked. And all they did was to alternate French music and German music. So day 1, and day 2. Do you know, that piece of music always makes everybody laugh. It must be the happiest piece of music in the world. Maybe we should all listen to it every morning. It's evidently very cheerful. Anyway, what happened? Well, on the French music days, French wine outsold German wine by 5 bottles to 1, which may not be surprising because it does tend to sell more generally. But on the German music days, German wine outsold French wine by 2 bottles to 1. Now that is interesting. And if you'd said to the people leaving that shop, did you buy that bottle of Liebfraumilch because of the German music playing? Do you know what they would have said? What music? Non-conscious, suppress, doesn't happen up here, happens down here, and that's the effect it can have on behavior. Now, you just start thinking, okay, what about the sounds that we're making or the sounds that the brands I interrelate with are making? What kind of bad effects might they be having if they're not planned, not designed? That's the issue. When we design a soundscape, and this is something you can take into your homes or into your offices, anywhere that you like, I do urge you to think about designing soundscapes in this way. We start from here. Now, it's not quite silence, is it? You're all listening now. You can hear some fans going on, various other things in this space. It is quite quiet down here. The Elizabethans described conversation as decorated silence. Now, isn't that a lovely phrase? Decorated silence. Why don't we do that? Let's decorate the silence with the sound that we make, with the soundscapes that we design. You can think of it as like making a work of art like this, where you have maybe some foreground sound you want to pay attention to, maybe some background sound that you just want to be supportive. You know, the fashion of playing music in every possible space is a bit like plastering every inch of the walls of a room with works of art by grandmasters. It's too much. There's a great argument for white walls. You don't come into a room and go, wow, look at those white walls. They're just there, and they support you. In the same way, there's an argument for a different class of sound between silence and music, a generative sound. There are lots of cool techniques we can use these days. Surface transducers, you can bolt them onto a hard surface like this, great for outdoor, and they turn the whole thing like a window or a steel plate into a loudspeaker. And hypersonic loudspeakers or very directional loudspeakers, we can create a pool of sound. So we don't pollute a whole space. Hear it here, don't hear it over there. Or a beam. But more important than that, I think, is generative sound. This is an example of a soundscape that we just recently installed in Harrods in London, in their fine glass department. It's generative, it's played by a computer, it's not recorded, it goes on doing this live all the time based on probabilities. And this is in the fine glass department. Every bit of sound in this soundscape was made by glass originally and has been treated and changed in various ways. So the soundscape is called glass, and it just creates a lovely ambience in the room, and it's the sound of what you're looking at, so it's entirely appropriate. Harrods is a big client. I'm going to move on to talk about a couple of others where we've deployed soundscapes. This is Glasgow Airport, and the brief here was to reduce stress. Now you're all becoming experts on sound, so you can hear this very gentle ambient soundscape in the background. This is about the level it was playing at in the airport. Many people didn't even notice it. Birdsong in there, yes? Reassured, cognitively alert. And how are we entraining people? What's the tempo of this piece of sound? It's pretty much dead stop. So it's very slow. And the tones are just major tones. They're just reassuring. Whatever you're thinking, it's not this bad. 1 day. 7 years, 1 day. No wonder most buildings sound terrible, because the architects just don't think about the ears at all. They design spaces that look great, and then we have to live in them. So the conversation really is about designing not just appearance, but instead of that, designing experience in all 5 senses. Okay, let's just finish off our little tour of that wheel of brand experiences with the one that I think is most appropriate and relevant here, and I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about radio as part of this. Branded audio, by this we mean putting a brand on some audio and delivering that audio to people. So in the old days it used to look like this. These organizations have made a far greater sum of money out of being a CD producer than out of being a bar or a hotel. I mean, they've sold tens of millions of those things. But nowadays, of course, it looks like this. And we don't have to make CDs anymore. It's a great deal cheaper. And the possibilities for branded podcasts and for branded audio are just just opening up. I mean, here's a good example from Nike.
This is Alberto Salazar.
So they send out this podcast, and it's Alberto Salazar talking you through your workshop, your workout on your iPod as you're running around the world champion. It's telling you what to do. So you feel good about the brand, you use your Nike equipment more, it's win-win. But I think there's a very interesting part of this whole conversation that gets unpacked when you start to consider the idea of delivering high-quality audio to people with a brand on top. Because after all, that's pretty much what radio does. There's a fusion going on here. Now, if my 19-year-old son wants to listen to music, where does he go? Anybody want to suggest? Thank you. It is indeed. Now, hang on, that's a video medium, isn't it? Well, not for millions and millions of teenagers, it isn't. It's where they go and listen to music. There is this fusion happening. There's a melting pot of stuff going on, of sources to get stuff, because it's all just bits and bytes now. I mean, you're probably familiar with all three of these, or if you're not, I do urge you to become familiar with them. I mean, that one, only if you're interested in DJs mainly, but that's a very good repository for largely musical sound. And Audioboo have a big deal now with the BBC, where they're delivering all sorts of BBC content on demand and with extra depth. We like Audioboo very much at the Sound Agency. I think it's an excellent innovation, which we're now recommending to many clients, to deliver spoken voice communication for free to their customers. So if you're a store like Harrods, having the head of the couture department do a weekly podcast for free and have all the ladies who spend thousands of pounds listening to it, and he's saying, well, this week we have Dolce & Gabbana coming in on Thursday, be there, we've only got 6 items. It's going to work, isn't it? Because it's human, because the voice is very personal, because of all the stuff that makes radio work. We feel it's personal communication. And then we've got these ways of listening to radio now. So radio is no longer a stream that's just delivered to us. We now can interact with it. We can listen to it when we want, how we want. And then if we want to listen to music, well, that really is an opening up. I mean, all of these things down here have come along in the last few years. And what's interesting and challenging, I think, for the radio industry is this. This is Spotify. You notice that word? Is that radio? This is Last FM. Is that radio? Now, I do think there's a challenge here for the radio industry. And guys, you're in danger of losing your word. What they mean by this is machine music. It's algorithmically programmed stuff. Put in James Brown, and it goes off playing. Now, you and I both know that if you come back an hour and a half later, it's anything but James Brown playing because the algorithms aren't that good at the moment, but they'll get better. Is this going to replace radio, or is this a part of radio? It's a challenge. What is radio now? What it definitely is not is that. It's got nothing to do with that anymore for most people. So actually, we've got a word that we have got to redefine because it doesn't have anything to do with radio waves anymore. I suggest that, and this really applies to all of us working in media across all different channels of communication, but here I'm talking particularly to radio as well as to everybody else. The thing radio really, really, really needs to be is a trusted guide. Because it's got the brands, it's got personalities, it's got relationships, it has an audience. What it means, really, ultimately, is relationship. Radio means relationship. That's the thing that radio needs to focus on. Now, I said I'd wrap this up by talking about listening, because, of course, if we're speaking into the world, which is what all of you are doing most of the time, literally or metaphorically, if nobody's listening, there's not much point, is there? And I do think there's a threat to listening. Listening is one of 4 things, read, write, speak, listen. It's one of the 4 ways we communicate. And of those 4, it's one that we spend a great deal of time in. Roughly 60% of our time is spent listening, and yet we retain only around 1 word in 4 of what we hear. Now, not you, of course, not this talk. You're retaining all of this, I know, but that is the average, 1 word in 4, roughly. What do I mean by listening? What do you mean by listening? Well, let's use this as a definition. Making meaning from sound. Very different from hearing. Hearing is the physical, chemical, and electrical process that goes on that makes that map of the world we were talking about earlier. Listening is what you select to pay attention to and make meaning from. So it's a practice, and it isn't that natural. How many of you got taught how to listen at school? 2, 3. Exactly. It's not natural. And yet we expect kids just to pick up being brilliant listeners somehow by osmosis or whatever, when they are surrounded by things that are going to stop them from listening. A couple of ways we listen, just so you know how it kind of works. First, and this is about selection, first pattern recognition. So if I'm in a party and it sounds like this and somebody says, Julian, behind me, I will turn around because I'm very attuned to the pattern of my name. And there are many other patterns in language that particularly that we're very attuned to. Look out or duck would be other ones in the English language. So those kind of patterns we recognize very fast and we grasp onto them. They have synaptic profiles in our heads that allow us to hear them very quickly. And then there's differencing. If I put this sound on, this is pink noise. If I left this for about 5 minutes, you would literally cease to hear it. Your brain would go, I'm not listening to that anymore. It's not done anything different, and it would cease to be in your consciousness at all. So we notice things that change, we discount things that stay the same. And we have a whole bunch of filters. Now, these filters are really important. Most people are not conscious at all of these filters in their listening. They go right from the big stuff, the culture that we're born into, the language that we speak, through the stuff that we learn from peers, from the people we respect, from our parents, siblings, teachers, and so forth, values, beliefs, attitudes. And then in any situation, it gets more specific because we go in probably with an intention and maybe with some expectations, and they all fashion our listening. Your listening is different from my listening. As different as your fingerprints are or your voice is from mine. We all have an individual listening. And yet we go through most of our life thinking everybody's listening to me the way I listen to them. That is not true. And it causes huge numbers of communication issues. So I really agree with Hemingway when he says this, in the sense that most people aren't really conscious of the skill of listening at all as an active process. And our listening is under threat. Let me just give you very briefly a couple of the ways in which listening is under threat. You may recognize these, and then I'm going to give you 5 ways to improve your listening and close for a couple of questions. Why is listening under threat? Well, first of all, we invented ways of recording. This first, and now this talk, for example, is being filmed, and it'll go up on YouTube, so if you go to sleep now, you can check it later. Don't. The premium for careful listening is not there anymore. Once upon a time, all knowledge was handed down orally, and if you missed it, you missed it. Now that's not the case. We've become impatient as well. I love this cartoon. And it's so true, isn't it? We don't want oratory anymore from our politicians. We want, just give me the top line. I haven't got time to mess about. We're all so time-starved. We can't listen to somebody talk for a long time. We get impatient. And desensitized. Now, this is about you guys, or some of you guys anyway. This is from the Red Tops in the UK. These words are used all the time. Sadly, in Red Top land, which, let's face it, is millions and millions of people every morning in the UK, you only have 2 emotional states. You can either be okay or you're furious. There's nothing in between. There's never anybody who's mildly upset about something. It's fury. You go straight to fury immediately. Well, if we coarsen human experience like that, I do suggest we lose something. We lose our listening to the subtle, the understated, the calm, the introverted. And then technology. I'm sure none of you have received this text message, and I'm sure none of you have sent this text message, but your children may have done. It does get sent, and it does get received. That's not a conversation. There's no listening there. There's a great TED talk and book by a woman called Sherry Turkle called Alone Together, which I do commend to you, where the thesis is that technology is not bringing us together. Technology is actually driving us apart by creating a world where we have lots of shallow relationships instead of a few deep ones. So it's worth considering whether that's true. Many of us take refuge in these. You know, when you were little, stick your fingers in your ears and hum. Well, now you can do the same thing, just looks a lot cooler with these on. That's shutting the world out, stopping the messaging getting in. But there are some downsides to this. That stands for noise-induced hearing loss. 1 in 8 American teenagers is suffering from noise-induced hearing loss now because of headphone abuse. That's a serious issue. And we also are changing society. We take a big social space like a train station or carriage or something, and we turn it from this into this. Millions of little individual bubbles where we're all locked away inside this sound bubble. In this situation, nobody's listening to anybody. So, I want to give you 5 techniques to improve conscious listening. I think it does matter. Why? Because listening is the doorway to understanding. Only by not listening to people carefully can we dismiss them as caricatures, and that road is not a nice road. I don't want to live in a world where people don't listen. Do you? So I think we need to teach this stuff at schools. Hopefully these 5 things you can take away and now spread the gospel out there after this talk. So the first tool or technique of listening is silence. Just a few minutes a day. I do recommend, maybe when you wake up, just lie in bed quietly, or if the kids are jumping up and down on you at that moment, you may need to go to a bathroom or something. Just try and if you can't get silence, the nearest thing is good. It resets your ears, recalibrates you. Second, this one is called the mixer. You can do this in any environment, even this noisy cafe I played you earlier on, and you can say to yourself, in this sound all messed up, how many individual channels am I listening to? What are the individual sources? It's like being on a mixing desk in a studio. You can do it in lovely places too. So here, how many birds can I hear? Where are those waves coming from? So you start to get very precise about your listening to individual events around you. It's very good for quality listening. Third, we have one called savoring, like this guy is with his cup of coffee. Now, this is my tumble dryer at home, and it's a waltz. And I played this a while back to an American radio show, and they happened to have an orchestra there, so they did this over the top of it. It's the tumble dryer waltz. And every time I put my tumble dryer on now, it reminds me of that. Actually, many of the mundane sounds around us have got a hidden choir inside of them, which we can listen to and enjoy if we unlock that by paying attention. So here's another great example. You've got one of these at home. Sure quite how much bass enhancement you've got on your kettle at home, but if you put your ear very close to it, well, not too close, you don't want to get burned, but if you put your ear close to a kettle, that's what you'll hear. It's a beautiful sound. So that's unlocking the choir in mundane sounds around us. Then probably the most important of all of these listening positions. I don't mean physical positions. This is a metaphor. So for example, think there's a house on a hill. If you don't like the way the house looks, you can get up, walk around the other side of the hill and see how it looks from that side. Now, if that's a metaphor for listening, many people, unfortunately, listen in a concrete bunker that they built many years ago, and they haven't ever considered that there's anywhere else to listen from. This is about playing with those filters that I made clear to you earlier on, using them as control surfaces, becoming active, and choosing where you listen from. I'll give you some scales of this very quickly. The first is active-passive. Active listening would be, it's used in therapy a lot. What I heard you say is, and then repeat the exact words that the person said. That means the person feels heard. If any of you have teenage children, it's a very powerful technique. What I heard you say is you want to kill me and you hate living here. Well, for the first time, for probably a long time, the kid feels actually heard. You'll get a look of surprise. Well, yeah, that's what I said. As opposed to go to your room and don't ever talk to me like that again, which is what normally would happen. So it's a very powerful technique in therapeutic or parenting or educational situations. Passive listening, on the other hand, Zen master, sitting by a stream, just listening. Nothing going on, just listening. That would be passive. These are arbitrary, by the way, these scales. You can make your own ones up. There are hundreds of listening positions. This one, something of a gender stereotype, but I think there's enough truth in it to make it worth saying. Men tend to listen in a reductive way, by which I mean for a point. There has to be a point to this. There's a solution to find. So typical male conversation, I've got this problem, here's the solution, thanks. in a nutshell. I mean, that's what men say most of the time, pretty much. Now, women, on the other hand, tend to listen more in an expansive mode. That is to say, there is no point. It's not about going somewhere, it's about enjoying the journey and just being with the person, smelling the roses, and having a good time with them. Tends to be eye contact when you're doing that, whereas men tend to talk side by side. Now, that kind of clash gives rise to situations excuse me. That kind of clash gives rise to situations where she comes home and says, I've had this awful day, this happened, that happened, this happened, I feel terrible. And he looks up from the football and says, have a bath, you'll feel much better. Now, in the male world, that's problem solved and he can go back to watching the football. In the female world, no, that really wasn't what she was looking for. She was looking for, you poor thing, sit down, let me get you a glass of wine, tell me all about it. Different ways of listening. Now, it's not true for everybody, but I think there's enough truth in that if you start playing with moving to the other position, if you're habitually in one of those, it can be quite powerful. And finally, critical empathetic. Well, critical listening is what you've been doing to me ever since I started. I don't agree with that. That's interesting. What did he just say? That kind of little voice in your head. Empathetic would be going onto the other person's island, feeling their feelings, and leaving the other person feeling understood, not just heard. Final suggestion for you as a practice is rasa. If you're in any of these roles, it will apply. Sanskrit word for juice, and here it stands for receive, appreciate, summarize, ask. So receive, as I often tell my teenage children, means when somebody's talking to you, you look at them. This is not receiving. This is receiving, leaning forward slightly. Appreciate is little noises like, oh, really? Especially on the phone. Summarize the word so, very powerful in conversation. So, what we're saying is this. You gather it all up, move it aside, move on to the next thing, and ask questions, of course. Rasa, very, very powerful in communication. So 4 golden rules for commercial sound. Let's make all of it congruent with the visual branding. Let's make it appropriate for every situation. Let's give value. If we're not making sound that's valuable, we shouldn't be making it at all. And finally, we need to test it, and test it. And if you want some to-dos to take away from today, here are a couple. For you as brand people, I suggest that you optimize your brand sound. If you haven't thought of it, get to it. I've given you lots of tools today. You could start to think about, can we make all this congruent and appropriate and valuable? Also, you want to have somebody who's accountable in your organization and make sure everything's consistent. And then for radio in particular, I think radio can redefine its word very powerfully, and it needs to do that now. Otherwise, that word is going to get lost to other people, meaning very different things. And the kids are already going to be starting to use it in those ways. Let's be trusted guides in sound. There's this tidal wave of content coming at everybody. That is a powerful way to be. And let's champion conscious listening. If we do that, and we start making sound consciously and receiving sound consciously, then we do have a chance of ending up with a world that sounds beautiful. And that is my vision, to create a world that sounds beautiful. I want to thank you very much for lending me your ears today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.